So in this lesson, we're going to be creating a simulation app where we're using the form data, and we're going to be showing you how you can do it both within a get method as well as a post to the server. And then when the server is just responding back with a JSON version of the content that we've submitted. So in this case, we're doing a post method, and we're also going to be showing you and demonstrating doing a get method using the form data that's available within the web page. This lesson, we're going to be making some updates to what we did in the last lesson, updating the content to have a form, and then the input fields are going to be placed within the form. So make some updates to the structure, and instead of having a output, we're going to update the output, and we can call this the my form, and using document and create element, and the element that we're creating is going to be the form. And then within the form, so first let's add the form to the page. So using the document body, and we're just going to append the form to the body of the page and add in the elements into the my form. So all of the inputs are going to get moved into the my form. So we'll add the button, and also where we create the element, we're going to append the elements, and then also append the initial input field all into the my form. So we're changing the structure. Let's go take a quick look at our source code just to make sure that everything is contained within the form. And so now the button can serve as a submit button for the form. And actually, let's just, before we continue, let's rename this. And I'm going to rename this to code 4 so that we have a different source file that we're working off, which is going to be different than the original project. So once you've confirmed that you've got all of the content of the form, you can use the form object content and output it as a URL search parameter. So this is going to simulate the same thing that we do when we submit the form. So if you have a form and you do a submit on it, it's going to automatically generate the URL that it's submitting to the server. So we want to send this via the fetch request, so we need to simulate that and build that before we can send it over. So when we do click the button, we're loading the data, and this is where it's going to be different because the base URL is still going to be the same, but we're going to generate the rest of the search parameters, and we're going to do this dynamically with JavaScript code. So we've got our base URL, and we want to append to it and get all of the values from the form. So we're still going to have to loop through all of the input fields. So I'm going to add, and I'm going to keep some of this here. And the construction is going to be different. So let me update that. And setting up, we're going to first define that we're going to have a new form object. So let's create the form data object. And with JavaScript, that's done using the new form data. So it's going to generate the empty form data. And then if we want to append to it, we can append it within key value pairs format. So that would be that if we select the form data and we want to append to the form data, so if we have a value of ID and we want to set the value of ID to be 99, that way we can append to the form data. Now, most of the time you are going to be using the post method instead of using the get method in this type of format, but this is just in case you do want to use the get method. It's going to be the similar format where you're constructing the form data, and then we could loop through, and as we loop through each one of the elements, we would be returning back the element name and then associating the element value to the object. So we're building the entire form object dynamically. And as well as using the query selector, you can also select the form data. So when we're directly creating the form data, we already have the form object within my form. So we can specify the object that we want to have the form content to. And over here, what we can do is as well, we can take the form data and we can get the entries from that object. So I'll block comment out this content. We'll go back into the console and do a click. So also we want to prevent the default action of submitting the actual form. So we'll get the event object and prevent default. So it will prevent any of the default actions on submitting the form. So we've got the iterator here. And if we want to get all of the form data, we use the 3 dots. And that will output all of the form data using the form data entries and structure them within a data object. So let's add in a value for data, and this can be an array, since it's an array of object, and using the form data entries. And let's log out data, as it's going to be data that we're going to send in, and then we're going to reconstruct this data object. So we're going to use the URI component, encode URI component, and let's create another object called parameters, and then taking the data object using map. And map is an array method. So we can return back the contents and map it back. So using x as our object value, and let's return back using map the contents of the array, and then we can output that content into the console as well. So what we're doing is we're constructing the request URL, the string object. So doing this, we can encode. So we can also just return back x, the first item within x, and equal sign, and do x1. But we should also do the encoding into it. So let's try this first and see what we've got. And just as we did before with the join, we could join the response data back together. And you can shorten this by having just one, by chaining them together. So getting parameters and then using join and the and sign. So that will join it together. So this is going to be so far the response request object that we're constructing. So we've got the request object almost completed. And just to be sure that it passes properly within the request object, we can use the encoding, the URI encode URI component option. So let's add that in. So using encode URI component. So this encodes it within the URI format, and that actually should be lowercase. So this is just in case we've got some odd characters that aren't going to encode properly. And that's actually a component. And I'm going to do the same for the other value as well. So this, instead of having the spaces, it does the percentage sign 20. And so this can still get read on the server, but this is a way of handling spaces, and so that within your request URL, you don't have any spaces. So now that we've constructed that, next step is to create the URL. So we've got the base URL and add to it our response object. And then finally, lastly, let's do the get URL and save that. And we've got the output here at the top, so that's why it's adding it to the top. So it's making the full trip to the server and returning back the content. So we can also update this, and actually what I'll do is I like to log it out into the console. I'll just add in the console message there. So we can update this to a post method as well. Let's make some updates to it. We'll create a new function, and this one can be get post. And what this will do is this will get the post data and do the request. So we need to pick up the data first. And instead of load data, it'll go directly to get post. So we'll remove out the load data, and we can get all of the form contents dynamically. So first off, let's prevent the default action of submitting the form. So the form is not going to get submitted. And then we want to build out all of the form data as well, so we can make the fetch request. And also let's set up a variable for options, and we'll make the fetch request with the options. So the options itself, this is the fetch options. So we'll set that up as an object. So setting the method that we want to use, and we want to use post as the method. And within the body of the options, so within the body object, this is where we're going to actually send the form data. So using JSON stringify, we're going to stringify the body object. So let's create the body object, and creating a brand new form data object, doing a new form data, and selecting the my form as the source for the data. And just as we did with the get request. And in this case, we want to construct a body object. So let's create our body object. And this is where we're going to deposit and append to it. So as we loop through the form data, and for each one of the items within the form data, so it's capturing all the contents of the form. Let's get a value and a key that's being returned back within the function. And for the values and keys, taking the body and using the bracket notation, we're setting the same key and then also assigning a value to it. So basically we're recreating the form, but we're constructing it and adding it to the body object. So this is going to return back a JSON formatted body object. And that's what we're going to be submitting ultimately to the fetch request. So let's see what that looks like and do the request. So there's our JSON, our JavaScript object within a JSON format that we're ready to submit. And when we stringify it, this turns it into one big string object. So let's create the fetch request. So using the base URL and the options that we've just set up, make the request. So when we get back the response from the server, the response is going to be within a JSON format. And then we can take the response contents and output it to the page. So for now, we'll log it out using the console log of data. So this object, and it's identical to the one that we just sent, and this is just coming from the server. So it's a server response to the content from the input field. So there's a lot of information that you can set up with the fetch request. So you can also add headers, and some server endpoints require different headers, credentials. So all of this can be contained. So some of them are a lot more complex, where they've got the body, they've got the method, but then they can also set the CORS. You can do cache, credentials, headers, setting the different content types, redirects, reference policies. So it depends on what type of data you're getting back. There's a lot of options that you can add in for the options on a post. And again, this is dependent on what you're expecting from the server. So also with the content from the input field, you can construct a JSON object. And there's also some other examples on the Mozilla Developer Network where they're looping through and they're appending to the form data manually, where they're building up the form data object. And there's even more options there for the headers and how you can set the headers. So in order to add headers, you can construct new headers. So just my headers. And then you would add the headers object into the options like that. And I'll see if it still works. So it still works because we haven't added any headers. And if we do add some of the headers, it could throw off our request. So it doesn't always help to add in headers. So you got to make sure what type of headers your endpoint is expecting. That's what you're able to add in. So once we've made the request, let's output the object data. So just as we did before, where we've got the data being returned back. And this time we're doing a post request, so the get request. So we click it, and we're populating the content on the page. The tasks and challenges for this lesson is to use the form data. So using JavaScript form data to get the contents of the form, reconstruct your page object to be contained within a form, and then select all of the fields within the form using JavaScript. So using the get method, make a fetch request, sending the data over to the server using get, and then also try the sending over the data from the form using the post method, and also update the page contents with the server response JSON object that is returned back whenever you do any types of sending of the content over, so either the get or the post, and output the contents on the page.